Okay. Hey, my name is Victor Yarlett, and I'll be talking about finding trolls under bridges. More specifically, I'll be talking about our work, our preliminary work on a motif detector done by us in the Cognition, Narrative, and Culture Lab at FIU, along with our colleagues from SIFT. And I think one important question that some or maybe all of you might have is, what exactly are motifs? And so motifs are it's this idea that comes out of folkloristics. And a very simple way to describe it is that they are distinctive, recurring narrative elements found in folklore and more generally in culturally inflected materials. Another way that you might describe it, an even simpler way, is you might call them cultural memes. And according to Stith Thompson, motifs can generally be divided into character, prop, and event motifs. Those aren't the exact words he uses, but that's generally the framework he uses. And one great example is the troll under the bridge. There are other examples for, if you're talking about a very difficult problem, you might refer to it as a Gordian knot. Or if you're talking about a very powerful solution, you might refer to it as a silver bullet. And one thing that makes motifs very interesting are that they are ubiquitous. You can find them all over the places. One very prominent example is Osama bin Laden had once referred to George W. Bush as the Pharaoh of the century. And if you're lacking any sort of context for that, and you're not part of a group that understands what that motif is, you might say, okay, so maybe he's like a really impressive ruler. But it in fact refers to this oppression that they experienced underneath the pharaoh, and it's basically calling him the worst and most oppressive person to have ever existed. And that's part of them embodying this wealth of related ideas that are drawn out of folklore. Another example, going back to the troll under the bridge, if you're knowledgeable about that, it can help explain the term patent troll. So in folklore, the troll under the bridge is this, sort of mean creature that squats under a bridge that he doesn't own. He accosts passerbys and extorts money from them through threats of physical violence. A patent troll is this, mean sort of company or individual who squats on an idea that they don't really own, accosts companies who are, making use of this idea under their broad patent, and extorts money from them through threats of legal violence. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what a motif annotation pipeline looks like, and this is the general framework that we're using. And first, to be clear, there is something that has to be done manually every time you have a set of motifs, as we're not addressing this problem, but you have to create a list of all the motifs that you're interested in and enumerate their lexical forms. And this is because, for example, the motif Fin McCool also has many different variants, so Fionn McCumheil, that sort of thing. You make a motif rule list and you feed this into a lexical matcher, and then you can go out and gather raw text that you're interested in that might have these motifs. And we take this raw text and we take the lexical matcher and we run it over there to produce these things that we call motif candidates that are basically just areas where the surface form of motifs occur. And from this point, you can either have manual or automatic annotation. As no doubt many of you are aware, manual annotation requires human annotators. It's a very lengthy and expensive process. And what our hope is that our automatic system, our automatic motif detection pipeline, can sort of fill the same role of these human annotators. And that role is to look at these motif candidates, these surface forms, and determine which of 4 classes they fit under. Either they're a true motific usage, so that means that they're being used with the intent to invoke this greater constellation of ideas that come out of the background of the motif. They're referential, so it's either someone referring directly to about the source or defining the motif or something along those lines. Eponymic, which is a very strange case, which is, for example, if you have the band Behemoth, that may have been named with the intent to invoke these motific connotations, but if someone is just talking about the band, they themselves are not trying to invoke that. They're just referring to the band. And then truly unrelated uses. And then after that process, you have these classified motif candidates. I'd like to talk a little bit about the data production in human annotation. More specifically, the motif selection. There are sort of 4 considerations for which motifs we actually are examining. The first is to identify what cultural group you want to draw motifs from. And this was done by us by sort of trying to get a leg up on the problem by looking for sources that both had an easily obtainable source of the folklore and also had existing motif indices. So a lot of the legwork has already been done by the folklorists in the field. We chose, after much deliberation, to focus on Irish, Jewish, and Puerto Rican motifs. You want to find highly referenced motifs that occur throughout news articles or Twitter, that sort of thing. Find the definitive source within the folklore and estimate the strength of the motifs. And so examples of these motifs are, Irish has Finn McCool. So you might say a young Finn McCool with limbs that might bestride a bullock. So someone very strong and heroic and powerful. Or out of Jewish folklore, there's the Tower of Babel. So communism had crumbled like the Tower of Babel. Or in Puerto Rican, the coquille, you might talk about the coquille's clamor, the sound that it makes as a representation of everything that is Puerto Rican. Annotation was done through double annotation, done through pairs of annotators. As I mentioned earlier, they annotate either motific, referential, eponymic, or unrelated. They were given training and a weekly, and there were weekly adjudication sessions to sort of reinforce that. The annotation was done via BRAT, and they're given a motif annotation guide. They are, of course, not allowed to communicate with each other during the actual annotation period, and they only discuss the motifs together at the weekly adjudication meeting. And our annotators have reached an agreement of Fleiss kappa of 0.55, which is, it's strong to, it's a relatively strong level of agreement. To talk briefly about our architecture, for pre-processing, we have some standard NLP tools such as using Stanford's Core NLP or Spacey just to pull out these sort of sorry, I glanced at Slack where I see someone is posting. To draw out things like parts of speech, NER, that sort of thing, and also targeted pre-processing. This targeted pre-processing is primarily used in our more targeted feature extraction that focuses on these classes of motifs. So for example, in character motifs, we're interested in things like animacy and co-reference with animate entities. Or for prop motifs, we are interested in their semantic, grammatical, and possessional relationships, especially with animate objects. So for example, you might imagine a prop motif is an object that is used by an animate entity. And for event motifs, we're of course interested in event detectors and also how they fit into semantic roles. And we use just standard support vector machines for classification. To talk about some preliminary results, we've run this through with a Boolean metaphor feature where it's true if the span is metaphoric or false if it isn't. It performs rather poorly across the board on everything except for referential candidates. It does all right on motifs, and we believe that this sort of shows that there is some overlap between motific and metaphoric language, but it's obviously not one-to-one. And one reason for this is that the referential usage may be more literal, strictly literal. And so while the Boolean feature does get some of the overlap between motif and metaphor, it's much better at detecting referential. To talk about future work, we're planning on continuing the development of the motif detector, especially because we believe it would be so great for being able to produce large, once it gets to a certain level and we can prove generalizability, being able to produce large amounts of interesting data. and completion of the annotation study, and also examining things beyond just motifs based in folklore, but motif-like things out of, for example, niche internet subcommunities. To talk briefly about our contributions, we've shown the preliminary agreement measures suggesting that humans who have the relevant background, all of our annotators came from the culture that we were interested in, that cultural group, can reliably distinguish motific usage of motif surface forms. We presented our architecture, and we have presented preliminary results on the use of metaphoricity as a feature for this. That's the end of my talk. If you have any questions, I'll answer them in 2 minutes, or we can talk in the Slack channel.
Perfect. I see several comments. I think they're the same comments.
Those aren't questions, but I do encourage people to look at tvtropes.org. It's hilarious.
TV tropes is a very similar and funny concept. Yeah, and morphology of the folktale is a similar concept to motifs, but not quite. And we sort of believe that it may fall somewhere on this on a sliding scale of more motific to less motific. So sort of this framework of narrative elements.
I think you should look at politics too. It's a great source of motifs.
Yeah.
Actually, where's your data coming from? What data did you label?
Our data is news articles that we basically just downloaded from LexisNexis, which is this big news search engine, and we searched for some of the motific terms and downloaded that, and then used the lexical matcher to determine exactly where it was. We've also found the motifs in other sets of non-targeted data. So for example, the I'm trying to remember, we found, I should say motif candidates, not motifs. We aren't annotating this data, but in things like the GigaWord corpus.
Interesting.
I see that Ernie has a little hand icon.
Yeah, your previous slide, the second to last slide, was very interesting with the results. Do you happen to have handy what these various categories are, reference and so on, eponym, so on? Not exactly clear to me.
Yes, I can try to explain it again briefly. So motific is what our annotators who are embedded in the culture believe is a true motific usage. So it's a usage that is trying to invoke these ideas. So if you call someone a Finn McCool and their name isn't Finn McCool, you're basically referring to them as, perhaps someone very strong or someone very heroic. Eponymic is something that has been named after a motif, and the act of naming it could have been motific, but if you're referring to it, it's not necessarily motific. So again, the band Behemoth is this sort of monstrous, evil sounding, name for this band that produces rather harsh music. But if I'm saying, yo, I went to the Behemoth concert last night, it was pretty good, you might not be intending to use that in a motific way. Referential is basically referring to the motifs, but it's either the original source or definitional, and unrelated is unrelated.